Welcome to Tales from the Trenches Tuesdays. Today it is my absolute honor to have Malcolm Burrows with us.
Here's a story of a fundraiser who was launching his very own web show. Each episode is very short due to edits, so it can really flow. Here's a story of a podcast guest star who was busy raising money of their own. They were each great in their own way, fundraising in his own. Till the one day when Jack asked a guest to join him, and they knew it was much more than a jest, that these guests must somehow form a resource. That's the way they all became the podcast guests. The podcast guests, the podcast guests. That's the way they became the podcast guests.
Malcolm is a philanthropic advisor and gift planner with over 34 years of experience. He's the head of Philanthropic Advisory Services at Scotia Wealth Management. He founded and leads Aqueduct Foundation, a public foundation with donor-advised funds. Aqueduct is the 13th largest foundation in Canada by assets and has granted over $766 million to registered charities since its inception almost 20 years ago. He also leads Scotia Wealth Management's 100-year-old private foundation services practices. Before joining Scotia, he worked for three major Toronto charities from 1990 to 2004 and started his career in the arts. Malcolm is an active educator, writer, and volunteer in the charitable sector and wealth planning community. Through the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, he has contributed to the development of new charitable tax incentives, including the elimination of capital gains on gifts of public securities and the estate donation rules. His proposal for gifts of private securities and taxable real estate, published by C.D. Howe Institute, was included in the 2015 federal budget. He was CAGP's course director from 1999 to 2011 and is a member of the Government Relations Committee. So, welcome, Malcolm.
Thanks, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here.
One of the things I always like to share with the listeners is some great experiences or not so great experiences that we both had out there asking for support for our various organizations. So tell me about one of the best canvases you were on.
Some of the best... I think actually, in many ways, what I define as a great canvas, a great sort of donor interaction, is the organic ask. And this has happened to be a lot, where you end up, again, we're taught as fundraisers that an ask looks like a certain way, and you have to have it well defined, and you have to have an amount, and it has to be proactive, and all the rest of it. So often, though, it's a matter of having those conversations, and the best ones are often where the donor ends up stepping up early, and it's usually not fully defined within the first meeting, but they're happy to have the engagement. And if anything, they don't want to resolve it all in the moment. What they want to do is have a longer conversation. And it's typically led to the largest donations. So this assumption, this old capital campaign assumption that you go in, ask for an amount, pledge it out, sign it here, is I'm not much of a fan of. What I love is when there's a meeting of the minds, a meeting of mission, and it ends up opening up and turning into longer, deeper conversations. And it's not unusual in those situations where the donor surprises you. It's sort of, they give 10 times what you originally dreamed of. Why? Because you gave them space, as opposed to trying to nail them into the corner.
That's so true. You know, you're often trying to raise money for a certain particular set of projects that are there. And if it happens to align with the donor's values, that's great. But I would say 99% of the time, the donor has their own set of values as to what they want to see. And if, you know, it was a little bit more fluid and you met the donor where they were at, perhaps you would get a much larger donation because it's accomplishing the donor's goals that just so happen to also work with your goals as opposed to your goals, which may or may not work with the donor.
Right. years ago, when I was at the University of Toronto, they were just finishing up a very large campaign, and at the time it was a large campaign, and they had, after arguing for many years within the university, they'd identified X number of projects, and each one had a monetary goal, and it was like a shopping list. And the campaign greatly, exceeded the goal by, 30% or something like that, but only 25% of the original projects were funded. Why? Because they planned wrong. And so, and particularly with larger comprehensive campaigns that move more thematically, how do you get that in between sort of essentially the free donor market and a central planning model? It's about that development, about listening, about sort of crafting the gift. And I'm a big believer in that. I think that it should be institution-led, and you always have to avoid mission drift, but that engagement is essential as well. It can't just be a shopping list.
Right. And part of the issue is there's always so much pressure from boards and bosses, as my friend Jason Lewis calls them, to hit a goal at a certain amount of time. I can't stand when they say, it's December 31st, you got to give us your gift before then for a charitable receipt. And I'm like, it means they're going to take a gift on January 1st. Like, how silly and short-sighted, right?
The nature of campaigns is in many ways, to be fair to sort of the model, is that it brings urgency, it brings focus. But sometimes, frankly, essentially what you're saying is, it's kind of false urgency at times. We understand it. And if you step back, are we actually losing donors? Are we losing engagement through this sort of process? So figuring out some flexibility around it is something that's really important to get that larger engagement. So.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you look at your former place of employment, U of T, right? So they're on their $1 billion campaign. They haven't said it's going to be in X number of years. They're going to hit $1 billion.
That's right. That's right.
So I would venture to say every charity is going to hit $1 billion. Some may take centuries to hit $1 billion, but everyone's going to hit $1 billion at some point. So you kind of lose that whole urgency that's on there. If I might,
please, no, I won't digress with the University of Toronto. Love them though that I do. So,
so if I might look at the flip side of that coin, which is what is the worst canvas you've been on? Because we've all been on some real ugly canvases where afterwards we said, "Oh my gosh, that was horrible," went right off the rails. So let's hear one of yours.
Oh, it was a classic. One of my faves was this, just because it was so deeply, deeply painful, was a solicitation where a couple, she had he was the prominent business person. She was the one that had a deep, deep engagement and involvement with the organization. She had that history. And the process was we went in and we were sexist. We focused on the man. We didn't focus, and we weren't sensitive. I think in that case I was more of a briefcase carrier because I want to deny it. But I think it's something that often happens in this space. And the husband stopped the solicitation midstream and said, "I'm not your donor. My wife is."
Right.
And it is deep ingrained sexism was at play. And before that, there was all sorts of prospect research that was looking at his net worth and all the rest of it. And there wasn't that fundamental respect and acknowledgement of her engagement and involvement with the organization. So I can tell you that it ended badly. It frankly, 2 years later, it was ended up being repaired, but it was a painful learning. And I think often our assumptions, there's all sorts of assumptions that we have going in about who we choose, how we address people, and that basic consideration. It was so. No, I'm still scarred by that. So.
It's so interesting because there's a donor that's a large philanthropist in the community, and it's his family money where most of the donations come. But his wife is truly the larger philanthropist who likes to give stuff away. And if you address something to Mr. and Mrs. or Bob and Susie, he won't even read it. Her name has to be first.
And I think this is so important, and I see it again and again. It's not as if this is a problem of the distant past or anything.
Right.
I see that with family foundations that I work with, where the patriarch gets all of the solicitations, the patriarch gets the call, and there's this whole dynamic there that's doesn't actually reflect the internal dynamic of the family. It reflects this public perception of where the power and influence is.
Most definitely. Do you find that many of the family foundations involve the subsequent gens, or is it each kind of generation does its own thing and you'll get your chance to do it when I'm in the next world?
Both.
Okay.
Though there's this perception, and I think this is something that's actively promoted by sort of the family governance sort of world. And it's really important. We've made a lot of progress in terms of how do we work together as families? How do we deal with power issues and dynamics within families? How do we transition businesses? How do we manage wealth together? Those sorts of things are really important, but it's very interesting. And there's often this perception that a family foundation should be, to use the cliche, everybody sitting around the table holding hands and singing Kumbaya. And the reality is far more complex than that. And so I've had a remarkably high percentage of sort of G1 founding generation just doing their own thing initially, and then bringing in the next generation. I've had a foundation that was a significant foundation that the kids there's 3 kids. They weren't told about it until their parents had passed away and found out that there was a lot of money there. And it was surprise, that Hollywood reading of the will moment where they all find out that, yes. So there's, but ideally, you have a family that works well together, that is really committed to bringing together that governance of a good charity within the family. And it's that much more complex because of the historical dynamics that all families have, I think.
Yeah, I've noticed that the larger donors, those uber donors that give the high 6 or 7-figure gifts during their life, as a rule, tend not to be as generous in their estate planning as, the little lady who gives you $20 a month for 30 years. And so many of them would say, I'm leaving it to my kids. If they want to give it out of their estate proceeds, so be it, but I don't want to dictate it for the kids. Do you see a lot of that?
I do, but increasingly I'm seeing these enormous balloon gifts. And so because it's a matter of public record, there's a couple of sort of 5-year-old private foundations that the founders have died within the last 5 years. And all of a sudden you're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars come from their estate. And so they were sort of, and one of them was Ron Joyce of Tim Hortons fame. He died in, I think, 2018, 2019. And that's a $500 million foundation now. And if you look at the records, again, are all public, all of a sudden it went boom. And before that, it's not that he didn't have money. It's not that he didn't give. He had a life of giving and engaging. But all of a sudden, you have these enormous balloon donations, and the amounts are such, we've never seen them before in Canada anyway.
Malcolm, this has been absolutely amazing. I love chatting with you. I've heard you speak dozens of times. I can recall once here in Ottawa, I remember giving you a lift out to to the airport after you spoke somewhere. If folks wanted to get hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
Oh, just one of the best ways at this point is just through LinkedIn. I mean, send me a request. Anybody from the sector becomes my a connection on LinkedIn. I really think it's important, and I have a lot of channels that open up, lots of chats, and as I said, I'm constantly learning from sector colleagues. It's so important to me. The worst thing that I could do is, I'm literally in a large tower right now that's having power problems because of the large summer rainstorm. But in a large tower in downtown Toronto, and it's so important to have that connection, to have the colleagues, to have these different experiences. And so I always, every week, I didn't spend time with colleagues from the sector. I'm learning, I'm finding out what they do. Sometimes we're able to help with funding and things like that. But if I don't have that ongoing engagement, if I don't have that ongoing learning, one of my great fears in life is to become a fogey. I don't want to be a fogey, and I would need that connection with my colleagues in the sector as a result.
Malcolm, this has been absolutely amazing, and I thank you so much for coming on.
Well, Jack, thanks for the invitation. It's just been great. I really appreciate it.
Hi, folks. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button right here.